Welcome to Preston and its Guild, an intriguing journey into the past, from the days of horse-drawn carts to the introduction of the motor car, and from the Guild of 1902 to the Guild of 1992. During those 90 years, both professional and amateur filmmakers in Preston captured the lives of those around them, providing us with a fascinating insight into a century of turmoil and change. When this film was shot at the Guild celebrations in 1902, around 25,000 Prestonians were employed in the cotton industry, a fifth of the total population of Preston, and the floats in the 1902 Guild reflected the importance and dominance of the textile industry. In Preston alone, there were more than 52,000 looms and 1.7 million spindles. The Guild Mayor of 1902, seen here in his chains of office, was Frederick Stanley, the 16th Earl of Derby, who during the 1860s had served as Preston's Member of Parliament. The title Earl of Derby can be traced back to its creation in 1139. 40 years later, in 1179, King Henry II granted Preston the right to have a guild merchant, when he gave the town its first royal charter. The Guild was an organisation of traders, craftsmen and merchants. It had a monopoly of trade in the town, and only its members could carry on a craft or business. Newcomers could only trade here with the permission of the Guild, and such approval was not given lightly. Anyone who claimed to be a member had to come to Preston and in a public court swear loyalty to the mayor and the Guild merchant. Their credentials were checked, and if they were eligible and they paid a small fee, they were admitted as a burgess, the name for a member of the Guild merchant. The first reliably recorded celebration of the Guild was in 1397, when it was already more than 2 centuries old. It was soon accepted that these gatherings were only needed once in a generation, and so from 1542 onwards, Preston Guild took place every 20 years. For 5 centuries, the Guild merchant controlled trade in Preston, but in 1790 freedom of trade was introduced. But rather than lead to the abolition of the Guild, it survived because the Guild celebrations had developed into prestigious social occasions. The Guild drew large crowds of visitors to witness not only the processions, but the enormous range and variety of events. One of the most popular were balloon ascents, like this one at Moor Park in 1902. It was reported by the Lancashire Daily Post that the aeronaut was Mr. Percival Spencer, who'd made more than 1,000 balloon ascents and hundreds of parachute descents. He was accompanied by 2 men who had the distinction of having made a balloon ascent at the previous Guild in 1882. The Guild celebrations were a way of showing the world Preston's importance, power and sophistication. The traders and craftsmen held processions and wore colourful costumes, carrying banners and emblems of their trade. The borough regalia was brought out for display, gleaming silver maces, swords and pikes, and embroidered banners and standards. The Guild mayor and members of the corporation wore their finest robes of office and were attended by trumpeters, mace-bearers and sergeants in traditional costume. And the 1902 Preston Guild was no exception. One notable burgess of the Guild merchant was John Horrocks, the founder of a mill-owning dynasty that from the 18th century would dominate Preston right into the early 20th century. Horrocks started his business in a corner of his father's offices in Edgeworth, where he set up a few spinning frames. The business grew so rapidly that around 1791 he moved to Preston, where he began to manufacture cotton shirtings and longcloths, as well as spinning cotton yarn. Within a year of his arrival in Preston, he'd built his first large mill, and soon after sealed his success with an order from the British East India Company to supply cottons and muslins for the Indian market. Horrockses would go on to provide employment for generations of Preston people, and such was the importance of the company that in 1913 it was visited by King George V and Queen Mary. Seven years later, the mill once again welcomed royalty, this time from the Sultan of Zanzibar, confirming the importance of Horrockses as an influential player in the global cotton market. The Sultan was given a tour of the mill, and the visitors from East Africa were greeted with great excitement. In 1922, Preston once again celebrated its guild. This footage was shot by filmmaker Will Onder, who played an important role in the cultural life of Preston and was a colourful character with an interesting history. Will Onder was actually the stage name of Hugh Raine, a music hall entertainer and acrobat, who was born in Preston in 1869. He went on to form his own film company, the Preston Film Service, where he made local interest films and copied and distributed feature films to cinemas across the north of England. The Guild Mayor of 1922 was Henry Astley Bell, another big player in the cotton industry. But by then, textiles were in decline. The Great War had ended only 4 years previously, and cotton mills were closing in Preston, as factories opened in Japan and India where labour costs were cheaper. In 1924, Ernest Maynard, another prolific local filmmaker, took to the streets of Preston to film a busy market day. Street traders selling their wares in the same way their ancestors had done for centuries. A more sombre event took place in 1927 when Will Onder's cameras recorded the unveiling of Preston's War Memorial. The cenotaph had been designed by the architect Sir Giles Gilbert Scott and paid for by voluntary public donations. The Admiral of the Fleet, Earl Jellicoe, led the occasion, inspecting the troops and laying a wreath. Large crowds of spectators also gathered to honour the memory of more than 2,000 men from Preston who were killed in the First World War. The following year, Ernest Maynard embarked on a 10-year project to record the remarkable changes that took place in Preston during that decade, from changing fashions to transport, and where, in the marketplace, you could buy just about anything. Despite the economic depression of the early 1930s, Preston still enjoyed a little luxury and sophistication. And one of the places this could be found was Booth's Cafe, where the fashionable meet. In 1847, tea dealer Edwin Henry Booth, who was then just 19, opened the China House in Blackpool, having borrowed £80 in goods from the Preston grocer who taught him his trade. 3 months later, he'd repaid the debt and went on to open other stores around the county. When his son John added cafes to the stores in 1902, they became a popular destination for lunching and afternoon tea. In 1935, the country celebrated Jubilee Day. George V had been on the throne for 25 years, and to mark the occasion, events took place in Moor Park and Avenham Park. A year later, and the king would be dead, to be succeeded by his son Edward VIII. In the same year the king died, Preston Royal Infirmary proudly filmed its rapidly developing facilities. The hospital had opened in 1870, funded through charitable donations and gifts from wealthy benefactors. Over the years, many notable dignitaries had supported the work of the hospital by opening new wings and laying foundation stones. Here in 1925, the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Mary, opened the new nurses' home at Preston Royal Infirmary. She also laid the foundation stone for the new patients' block, named the Princess Mary Wing. During the First World War, Mary visited many hospitals, supporting projects that gave comfort and assistance to British service personnel and their families. She launched the Princess Mary Gift Fund, raising £100,000 for gifts that were sent to all British soldiers and sailors in the Christmas of 1914. 4 years later, she took a nursing course and went to work at Great Ormond Street Hospital and was a respected figure within the growing profession of nursing. By 1936, 12 years before the introduction of the National Health Service, the hospital was yearly treating 13,000 patients in the casualty department and conducting 35,000 operations. 100 people a day were being treated in the dressings department, and there were 32,000 outpatients. On the children's ward, far from being stereotypically austere, Matron was filmed laughing and smiling with the youngsters as they saluted one another. Fresh air and exposure to sunlight was seen as an essential prescription for good health, and most of the children were daily wheeled out in their beds onto the balcony. Not that any of them seemed to mind. There may also have been a few sore heads amongst this group of football supporters following the dramatic 1938 Cup final match between Preston North End and Huddersfield. Thousands travelled down to Wembley by train and coach for what turned out to be a nail-biting couple of hours. After 29 minutes of extra time, Preston scored the winning goal and the boys returned home to a rapturous welcome. The interwar years in Preston witnessed a remarkable boom in house building, and as such, in 1938, the corporation embarked on a massive slum clearance programme. In this film, shot by Preston Borough Council in 1938, inspectors are seen assessing the gloomy 2 up and 2 downs in Spring Gardens. Once they had been earmarked for demolition, they were first decontaminated before being knocked down. Between the wars, more than 4,300 houses were built in Preston, with most being owned by the Borough Council. But before new residents were allowed to move in, the council demanded that all their belongings were first fumigated. And despite advances in motorised transport, Preston Borough Council still operated horse-drawn removal wagons. Once their worldly goods were fumigated, the new residents were free to move in, and life as they'd known it would never be the same again. These were socially progressive times for Preston, but in a few short months everything was to change with the outbreak of the Second World War. In this film, shot in 1939, servicemen and women marched through the centre of Preston during an event to raise funds for the Royal Air Force. The Wings for Victory campaign aimed to raise £1 million to pay for more aircraft. The RAF had been founded in 1918, but prior to the Second World War, it underwent rapid expansion when it was recognised how important air power would become in defending the nation. In the Battle of Britain, which took place just months after this film was shot, the RAF defended the skies over Britain against the German Luftwaffe, helping foil Hitler's plans for an invasion of the United Kingdom. 1942, another Preston Guild year, but for the first time in its history, it didn't go ahead. Britain was in the grip of World War, and there seemed no end in sight. Invasion exercises were critical to minimize civilian casualties, as was demonstrated in this film shot in 1942. Firefighters and air raid precaution wardens take part in training exercises, putting out fires at Horrocks' mill and the gasworks, as well as rescuing the trapped and the wounded. The town had been attacked during the 1941-42 Blitz and would again experience further raids during the flying bomb offensive of Christmas 1944. A combination of the imposed blackouts during the war and increased traffic on the roads led to an alarming rise in the number of people being killed or injured in road traffic accidents. In 1943, the Accident Prevention Committee organised Preston's Safety Week. Posters and adverts on buses warned pedestrians to take care, and in Avonham Park, an event was held to demonstrate the consequences of poor road sense. But the campaign wasn't successful. By 1945, more than 1,500 children alone were being killed on the roads every year. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents introduced the curb drill in 1942. Look right, look left, look right again. When all is clear, quick march. And ever more sophisticated ways of promoting road safety were being sought.
A fine day brought several thousand people to the scene of the accident prevention display, at Preston Park, marked off to represent an ordinary highway and crossroad. The display was designed to show how easily one can become the victim of an accident and how easily one can cause accidents by lack of thought or lack of care and consideration for others. Mr. Noel Baker, in an impressive speech, told the spectators of the magnitude of the task facing the authorities in their efforts to reduce road accidents. 200,000 accidents, he said, occurred every year. In 10 years, 60,000 people had been killed and 2 million injured on the roads of this country. No nation could afford such a drainage of their manpower and resources. A feature which attracted much attention was a miniature cenotaph dedicated to the memory of 6,000 children killed on our roads during the war years. What stark tragedy there is behind that simple inscription. Another attraction was a safety gate designed to prevent children running from their homes into the roadway. Many young lives have undoubtedly been saved by this simple device. Preston police have induced many parents to buy or construct one of these gates. Every home in which there are children should adopt this precaution. We now come to the cyclist who has not sufficient energy to propel his cycle in the normal manner. Numerous accidents are caused by this practice, which is extremely dangerous as well as being illegal. Don't try to save time and energy by doing this kind of thing, or you may find yourself spending the time you thought to save in hospital. Now we present an amateur gardener who, after a hard day's work, has been spending his leisure hours digging for victory. Apparently his gardening has produced good results and he's taking home the fruits of his labor. Some take flowers, this man takes cabbages. It's very dangerous to carry baskets or other cumbersome articles and ride a cycle at one and the same time. Remember always that a cycle is not a furniture van. We come now to a fellow who is in great demand these days, a window cleaner. Unfortunately, he's no truck, and he's making the dreadful mistake of riding his cycle and carrying his ladder. Just watch his antics. They're funny, aren't they? And yet, on the busy roads of our towns and cities, that man is a menace to all road users. Apart from road accidents, many people have been killed and injured by weapons and devices which were intended to deal with any possible threat of invasion during the Second Great World War. The weapons you see here include anti-tank mines, phosphorus bottles which burst into flames on contact with the air and which cannot be extinguished, cannon shells, mortar bombs, sticky bombs, and other deadly articles. Do not touch. If you encounter anything of this nature, do not touch. Inform the police at once. Many children and adults would have been alive today if they had heeded this advice. Do not touch. Let us illustrate this danger. Here are some normally healthy boys out for fun. One finds something in the road and picks it up. There's an explosion, and the boys, so recently healthy and happy, are writhing in pain. If only they had remembered this advice. Do not touch. This would never have happened.
Britain had now been at war for 5 years, and the cost had been great both in human lives lost and the economic cost to the country. In May 1944, Preston held a Salute the Soldier Week to raise further funds for the war effort. Preston dug deep and donated thousands. And despite the dark times, there were also some lighter moments, such as the military gymkhana at the Fulwood and Broughton Cricket Club. 12 months later, and the war was over. Within a month of the hostilities ending in Europe, the great war leader Winston Churchill visited Preston along with his wife Clementine. The flags of 33 countries within the United Nations were flown in his honor. But his visit had less to do with the war and more to do with the forthcoming general election. Churchill's son, Randolph, filmed here next to his father, was MP for Preston, but despite the support from Winston, later that year Randolph lost his seat and the Conservatives the election. It was during the First World War that one of the most successful women's football teams was created, Dick Kerr Ladies. By the time they were filmed here, between 1945 and 1955, they had played all over the world in front of thousands and thousands of spectators. In 1900, William Bruce Dick and John Kerr set up a company in Preston to manufacture trams and light railway rolling stock. In 1915, however, the factory was converted to produce ammunition as part of the war effort. As most of the men were away fighting, it was women who took over the manufacture of munitions. The government appointed women welfare supervisors to oversee the well-being of the factory girls. In particular, they encouraged the development of sporting activities, and football became the official sport of the munitionettes, as they became known. Almost every factory across the land involved in war work had a ladies' football team, but none were as successful as Dick Kerr Ladies. On Christmas Day 1917, 10,000 spectators travelled to Deepdale to watch their first match, which they won, and at the same time raised £600 for wounded soldiers. By 1921, the team's popularity was at its height, and they were booked to play an average of 2 games a week all over the British Isles. They played over 60 games of football that year, while still working full-time at the factory, and they were watched by almost 900,000 spectators across the country. Despite this, in that same year, the Football Association decided to ban women from using league grounds, changing the course of women's football forever, as many teams had nowhere else to train. Dick Kerr Ladies sadly disbanded in 1965. By then, they had played over 800 games of football and raised over £180,000 for charity. The men's game, however, went from strength to strength, and as the country welcomed in a new decade, Preston North End secured promotion. The war had put a stop to the Preston Guild celebrations of 1942, and instead it was moved to 1952. As fans celebrated the team's elevation to the First Division in the town, hours of work was going into decorating the streets to welcome the new guild. The organisers of the 1952 Guild established a link with Prestonians who had emigrated to Commonwealth countries, and they were sent scrolls of friendship, which they signed and sent back. The scrolls were contained in 2 replicas of the old town hall clock, carved from wood salvaged when the tower was burnt down in 1947. In 1952, Preston Harriers were given the honour of escorting the Guild scrolls in a 10-man relay from the docks at Liverpool back to Preston, and this tradition has continued ever since. The 1952 Guild ushered in a new period of hope and optimism. However, Preston hadn't entirely emerged from the shadow of wartime. In that same year, a steel scrap drive was held in Preston, and once again people were asked to give generously in support of their country. During the war, scrap drives were aimed at gathering material for planes, tanks, and munitions. By the end of the war, steel was in short supply. If the manufacturing industry was to recover, it needed the raw materials to build refrigerators, cookers, and washing machines, and Preston folk donated everything from bikes to beds. As steel production increased, so did the production of cars, and by the late 1950s, they were more affordable and there were more of them. The existing infrastructure hadn't been built to accommodate so many vehicles, and it needed redesigning. Preston led the way with the opening of the first ever motorway.
The rapid increase in car ownership since the end of the war has created difficult and serious traffic problems in all parts of the country. Vast numbers of motor vehicles were packed onto roads which were planned for horse-drawn traffic. Solid blocks of cars, bumper to bumper, 3 and 4 miles long, were not uncommon, and the police made the best of an almost impossible task. One of the blackest spots was Preston, through which traffic from the heavily industrialised areas of East and South Lancashire had to pass on its way to Blackpool, Morecambe and the Lake District. As long ago as 1937, the Lancashire County Council foresaw this problem and recommended to the Minister of Transport a north to south road through Lancashire restricted to the use of motor traffic. It was not until the 5th of December 1958, however, that history was made when the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Harold Macmillan, opened the Preston motorway, the first British road to be designed and built for the exclusive use of motor traffic. In his opening speech, the Prime Minister said, "This is a great, indeed an historic occasion, for today we are celebrating something new in the history of British transport, the country's first motorway. It is the symbol of the opening of a new era of motor travel in the United Kingdom. What Lancashire has today, other parts of the country will have tomorrow." As the Prime Minister was speaking after the celebration lunch, the traffic was already moving along the motorway. Of this magnificent road, exclusively for motor traffic, presented new problems to the Lancashire County Constabulary, and they built and equipped a motorway control station at Salisbury. Whatever emergency situation developed on the road, it was essential that the police should be able to take rapid action to keep the traffic moving, and a fleet of specially fitted radio-controlled brakes was provided for this purpose. Special attention has been given to the provision of traffic signs which can be easily read by drivers travelling at high speeds. These pictures were taken from a car travelling at about 75 miles per hour. They are designed to be legible from a distance of at least 600 feet. The design was based on the recommendations of an advisory committee set up by the Minister of Transport, which studied the use of traffic signs on comparable roads in America and Northwest Europe. Both the Preston and Lancaster motorways are recognized as magnificent feats of engineering. And in this connection, particular mention must be made of the bridges, of which there are 22 on the Preston and 27 on the Lancaster motorway. There is no doubt that the two motorways have eased the traffic problems of Preston and Lancaster, but a lot remains to be done. At peak times, the A6 road between the northern end of Preston motorway and the southern end of Lancaster motorway is unable to accept the flow of traffic which backs up along the motorways and eventually comes to a standstill. The need for the connecting road to complete the north-south link between Lancaster and Preston is very urgent, and the traffic problems of this part of the county will remain until this road and the link roads between Longton Bypass and Bamber Bridge, between Broughton and Blackpool, and between Halton and Morecambe are completed.
Preston Docks was also a busy transport route, with imports and exports of timber, coal, coke, china clay, oil, petrol and steel. This film was shot in the 1930s, when everything had to be taken off by hand. By the 1950s, mechanization transformed the import and export industry. In 1954, the banana run began. And in all, Preston handled 600 cargoes of bananas and tropical fruits from the Windward and Leeward Islands. Another reason why good transport links from Preston to the rest of the country was essential. Preston was proud of its traditions, but the town also recognised that it was important to embrace new ideas and correct some of the less flattering perceptions of life in the north.
Yes, please, Mommy. Unfortunately, of course, it will mean selling up house and moving.
Oh, dear. Somewhere pleasant, darling.
Central Lancashire.
Central Lancashire? Oh, my poor darling, how boring. You won't go, of course.
I don't see how we can avoid it unless Jim resigns. The MD seems to think the move will increase the company's profitability.
Oh, the man's a fool. Your father went there once on business, came back absolutely prostrated. They're unbelievably primitive, you know. They all have bronchitis, keep their money in teapots.
Oh, Mummy.
Darling, have you thought of the effect on the children?
But I must admit the health hazard does worry me. The children are so well, and they're really enjoying themselves at school now.
And do they still put the children down the mines at 12? Men are so utterly selfish. Jim must be mad. Has he thought of his beloved pub? You regret that. It's all spit and sawdust in the north, you know.
We don't actually know, do we? But I shall miss the village, and the country, and the sun. It's always raining in Lancashire.
No, I won't have it. How can I possibly come and see you up there? And I have no intention of allowing my grandchildren to grow up eating chips out of a newspaper in Coronation Street.
Ladies, if I could just butt in for a moment, this really won't do, you know.
I beg your pardon.
No, one moment, please. Could I, just for a start, say that apart from your good selves, we haven't so far seen a single frame of film that wasn't shot in the central Lancashire area. Yes, all those idyllic scenes were shot in the Black North, not the home counties.
This film was made in 1972 for the Central Lancashire Development Corporation and aimed to encourage people to relocate to central Lancashire. And by the end of the film, both women had been won over.
All in all, this really is a very pleasant place to live in. The fact that we have dozens of historic mansions and parks is proof enough. The families who built them were no fools. They knew a good thing when they saw it. We have our eyesores. I'll bet you do too. But there won't be any more. When your organization comes here, it will be separated from residential development in carefully landscaped areas. And then we also have the lovely Ribble Valley wandering down into our northern border. And Longridge Fell is a 10-minute drive away. Beacon Fell Country Park, about the same. And all the glories of the lakes are waiting for you an hour's drive up the motorway. And you know, the Trough of Bowland is in Lancashire too. And pretty villages, clean air from the sea, and a climate generally mild, even by comparison with the southeast. So then, have we made you feel any better?
Thank you, yes. Really quite relieved.
I'm quite won over. Such a pleasant voice, my dear. Young man, I'm coming north to live with you in wherever it is.
Oh, no. Oh, no. Anybody but her. Madam, it's very dirty up here and the people are awfully primitive and I'm off.
The 1972 Preston Guild also demonstrated a more modern interpretation of the old traditions. They certainly wore less than their predecessors of 1902. The textile industry was still prominent, but industries, new ones like aircraft manufacturing, also made their debut. The 1970s was a turbulent decade for Preston, with thousands of job losses in the textile and vehicle manufacturing industries. In 1974, the Central Lancashire Development Corporation set out how it could attract new businesses and new families with an ambitious scheme to develop 55 square miles of central Lancashire.
Everybody knows that change is necessary, and very few of us like it. But in the process of change, we must conserve the land available to us by planned use. We have to preserve what is best in our heritage, clean up what has been spoiled, and save as much as we can from further spoliation. All this and still provide the better living and working environment demanded by rising standards and the growth of population. People have lived and worked in these 55 square miles for 20 centuries. How is their mode of life to be improved in the 21st? After all, it's only 26 years away. We have only to look back to the 50s to see how fast the pace is changing. When we were being treated to the marvels of the 1951 Festival of Britain, who could have foreseen that within 25 years, 3 television channels would have revolutionized the living pattern of the nation? That 2 million Britishers would holiday in Spain every year, that we would have gone decimal, and that the price of beef would have soared higher than the exhibition's skylon. And above all, that man would be on the moon. In the development of central Lancashire, a variety of options will have to be kept open to cope with far swifter changes in the next 25 years. How many more of us there will be to feed and house is difficult to predict. But we do know that at the end of the century, this country will have 3.5 million people aged 75 or over, 1 million more than now. We shall have to provide increased accommodation and care for them. The young will have to cope with change as well. There are already signs that the classroom as we know it may take second place to direct tuition in society, in the field and factory. A sort of controlled return to children down the mines, in fact.
Preston was looking forward, and the town had changed dramatically to the Preston of 1902. In the 1960s and 70s, it would change culturally. British industry faced acute labour shortages, hampering the textile industry, which needed to run the mills 24 hours a day on multiple shifts. The labour shortage was met in no small part by migrants from India, Pakistan and the West Indies. By the time Preston celebrated its guild in 1992, these communities had also become part of Preston's rich history.